So picture this, it's late, like past midnight, and I'm driving home from school. 2 hours of empty highways, the kind of drive that makes you wish you'd just splurged on a train ticket. I'm tired, I've got a playlist barely keeping me awake, and it's just me and the road. At first, it felt peaceful, that kind of stillness where the world feels far away. But then I noticed them, headlights. They were round, almost old-school looking, and they popped up behind me on the freeway. No big deal, right? People drive at night. Maybe they're heading home too. But here's the thing, those headlights didn't leave my rearview mirror. Not for 50 miles. Every time I switched freeways, they switched too. I sped up to see if they'd pass me. Nope. I slowed down. They slowed down too. They weren't tailgating or anything, always keeping this perfect distance, like they were comfortable just hanging there. At first, I told myself it was a coincidence. A weird one, sure, but nothing to freak out about. But when you've got 2 hours to stew in your thoughts, your brain starts working overtime. By the time I was closing in on my hometown, my nerves were fried. The truck, because by then I could tell it was a truck, was still there, those headlights glowing steadily in my mirror. I couldn't see the driver, and that made it worse. Was it some bored guy messing around? Someone dangerous? My imagination was running wild. When I finally hit my exit, I thought, this is it. They'll keep going. No one's randomly following me into my small-town middle-of-nowhere exit. But nope, they took the turn right behind me. That's when it stopped feeling like paranoia. Something was definitely up. I wasn't about to lead them straight to my house, so I did the first thing that popped into my head. I spotted a 24-hour McDonald's, pulled in, and got in line at the drive-thru. Honestly, I wasn't even hungry. I just needed to figure out if they'd keep following me. And guess what? They did. They followed me into the parking lot. At that point, my heart was pounding so loud, I could barely think. But then, something weird happened. The truck slowed down, kind of hovered in the lot like it couldn't decide what to do next. And then, bam, it U-turned and drove off. Just like that, like they'd suddenly lost interest. I stayed in the drive-thru, half expecting them to pop back up, but they didn't. It was the strangest mix of relief and confusion. I grabbed a soda, because what else was I supposed to do, and sat there for a minute, trying to calm down. When I left the parking lot, I kept checking my mirrors, expecting those headlights to show up again. Every shadow, every pair of lights in the distance made my stomach twist. But the truck was gone. I made it home without seeing them again, though I barely slept that night. Every little noise outside felt like it was them, like they were just waiting for me to drop my guard. When I turned 18, I was on top of the world. I'd finally saved enough money from my minimum wage job to buy my first car, a 15-year-old blue Honda Civic I found on Craigslist. The guy I bought it from swore it was in perfectly good condition. Looking back, that should have been my first red flag. But at the time, I didn't care. It was mine, and it was freedom on 4 wheels. Excited to celebrate my new ride, I called up my best friend Stephanie and pitched the idea of a mini road trip. Just us, 2 girls, hitting the road with no set destination. She said yes immediately. The next afternoon, I picked her up, and we were off, windows down, music blasting, and a whole lot of confidence that nothing could go wrong. Spoiler alert, everything went wrong. We decided to explore the back roads of Wyoming, because why not? The scenery was beautiful, the roads were quiet, and it felt like we had the world to ourselves. 5 hours in, we were laughing, singing along to our favorite songs and swapping stories. It was perfect, until it wasn't. That's when my car started spewing thick, black smoke from under the hood. At first, we didn't know what to do. Stephanie and I both started freaking out, yelling at each other to do something, even though neither of us had the slightest clue about cars. I kept driving, hoping to make it to civilization before the car gave up entirely. By some miracle, we spotted a gas station in the distance. As we got closer, we realized it wasn't just a gas station. It was one of those half-gas station, half-mechanic shops. Relief washed over us. We pulled into the lot, the car still puffing like an angry dragon, and ran inside to find help. A mechanic was sitting out front, leaning back in a chair with a toothpick dangling from his mouth. He was older, scruffy, and gave us this long, uncomfortable look, his eyes trailing a little too slowly. When he finally spoke, his voice was raspy, and he spat out some tobacco-filled sludge before saying, "Let me take a look." He popped the hood, poked around for a few minutes, and then announced that the screws on the oil filter were loose, causing oil to leak out and burn. That was what had been creating all the smoke. "I can fix it," he said, gesturing for us to wait inside the gas station. Shouldn't take more than 15 minutes. The whole situation felt off. The guy gave us both the creeps, but we didn't have much choice. So we thanked him and waited anxiously. Sure enough, after 15 minutes, he came back and said the car was good as new. We tipped him, thanked him again, and hit the road. For about 5 miles, everything seemed fine. Then the car started shaking violently, and a loud thumping noise came from under the hood. My heart sank. We pulled over on the side of the empty two-lane road, feeling completely stranded. This was before everyone had cell phones, so we had no way to call for help. The sun was dipping below the horizon, and the shadows of the trees around us seemed to grow darker and more ominous with every passing second. Stephanie and I debated what to do. Should one of us stay with the car while the other went for help? Should we both leave the car? Just as we were trying to figure it out, we saw headlights in the distance. A grimy old Chevy truck was heading toward us. Desperate, we waved it down. The truck slowed and stopped about 10 yards behind us, its headlights blinding. A figure stepped out, and as they got closer, we recognized him, the mechanic from the gas station. Relief flooded us, and we called out, "Oh, thank God. Can you help us again?" But he didn't say anything. He just kept walking toward us, slow and deliberate. That's when we saw it. He was holding a large knife at his side. Stephanie didn't hesitate. She grabbed my hand and yelled, "Run." We took off as fast as we could, sprinting down the road. The man started chasing after us, his heavy footsteps pounding against the pavement. My heart was in my throat, and my lungs burned as we pushed ourselves to keep running. The road was surrounded by thick trees and bushes, and we made a split-second decision to dive into the underbrush. We crawled deep into a bush, trying to muffle our breathing as we crouched low. The branches scratched at our arms and legs, but we didn't care. We could hear the man running past, his boots crunching on the gravel. He was so close, we could see the glint of the knife in his hand through the gaps in the leaves. We stayed frozen, hardly daring to breathe, until the sound of his footsteps faded. Then we waited, and waited. Finally, when we were sure he was gone, we bolted out of the bushes and ran as fast as we could in the opposite direction. Eventually, we stumbled into a small town. Exhausted and terrified, we found a payphone and called the police. They came out to meet us, but they weren't much help. They searched the area but didn't find the man or his truck. We had a tow truck retrieve my car, and my dad came to pick us up. I was maybe 13 or 14, and my family decided to take this big road trip from California to Yellowstone National Park. If you haven't been, let me tell you, it's incredible. Totally worth the hype. But, of course, getting there? That was a whole different story. We were packed into our old Yukon XL like sardines. Me, my 2 brothers, my parents, and all our stuff. It was a 17-hour drive, and it felt even longer because my dad insisted on stopping at random little motels instead of driving straight through. But then, one night, we fell behind schedule. My dad, being the kind of guy who doesn't like delays, decided to just power through. He figured we'd make up for lost time by driving through the night. We all thought it was a great idea at first. My brothers and I passed out in the back pretty quickly, while my dad focused on the road, and my mom dozed off in the passenger seat. At some point, way past midnight, my dad must have decided it wasn't safe to keep going. I guess he was too tired, or the road was too dark, or maybe a bit of both. Either way, he pulled us into this tiny rest stop somewhere in the middle of nowhere. I don't even know what state we were in. All I know is that when I woke up, the car was parked in this unlit lot surrounded by trees. It was so dark outside, I couldn't see a thing beyond the windows. At first, I wasn't scared, just kind of groggy and uncomfortable. You know that feeling when you wake up in a weird position? That was me. I tried to adjust, hoping I'd fall back asleep, but it wasn't happening. My parents and brothers were all knocked out, their steady breathing filling the car. It was just me, sitting there in the quiet, staring into the darkness. After a while, boredom started to kick in. I fumbled around in my bag and pulled out this little yellow flashlight I'd packed. It wasn't super bright, but it worked. I switched it on, careful not to wake anyone, and shined it out the window. At first, I didn't see much, just trees, bushes, and the occasional rock. Pretty normal, right? But as I kept scanning, my flashlight caught on something weird. There, between 2 trees, was this shape. It wasn't clear at first, just a dark outline against the even darker woods. But the more I looked at it, the more it started to look like a person. Not moving, not waving, just standing there, watching. I froze. My heart was pounding so loud. I was sure it'd wake the whole car. But I told myself it wasn't real. It had to be a trick of the light. Maybe a weirdly shaped tree or a bush. That made sense, right? So I just kept staring, waiting for it to do something, anything, that would prove it wasn't a person. And then it moved. It wasn't much, just a little shift. But it was enough. The shadow turned, like it was pivoting on its heel, and then it stepped behind one of the trees. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. My hand shot out, flipping off the flashlight, and I yanked my sweater over my head like it was some kind of magical shield. My heart felt like it was trying to claw its way out of my chest. I didn't dare look again. I sat there, curled up in a ball, clutching that stupid flashlight like my life depended on it. Every tiny noise outside, the rustling of leaves, the occasional creak of the car, felt like it was them coming closer. I couldn't see anything, but in my head, I was sure they were right outside, staring into the car, trying to decide what to do. Time crawled. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but it felt like forever. I didn't move, didn't make a sound, just sat there with my eyes squeezed shut and my ears covered. At some point, the first rays of sunlight. One year, my friend and I decided to visit a mutual friend at her university. We'd planned the trip for weeks, classic college road trip vibes. She gave us these super detailed directions, and according to her, the drive should have taken about 3 hours, give or take. Easy, right? We packed snacks, cranked up the music, and hit the road ready for a fun weekend. At first, everything was fine. The drive was straightforward, and we were in good spirits. But then, somewhere along the way, things started to feel strange. I don't even remember when the woods started exactly. One moment, we were cruising down a normal stretch of highway, and the next, we were surrounded by trees. Not the cute, scenic kind of trees, either. These were tall, dark, and way too close to the road, like the forest was trying to swallow us whole. At first, it was kind of cool, like something out of a movie. The road was empty except for us, and the trees stretched endlessly in every direction. We joked about horror movies, laughing nervously as the woods dragged on. But after a while, the novelty wore off. It just kept going. I glanced at the clock, and we were already pushing past the 3-hour mark. According to the directions, we should have been there by now, but instead, we were still crawling through this endless forest. We started getting uneasy. Did we miss a turn? Did our friend mess up the directions? We checked and double-checked, but everything seemed right. There were no signs of civilization, no road markers, just us and this winding, shadowy path. The weirdest part? It felt like time had slowed down. The more we drove, the more disconnected I felt from everything. The road blurred into this monotonous loop of trees and pavement. We didn't talk much, just kept driving, our nervous laughter fading into silence. When we finally broke out of the woods and into our college town, it was nearly 4.5 hours since we'd left. We hadn't hit traffic, we hadn't stopped for more than a quick bathroom break, and we hadn't gotten lost, not that we knew of anyway. Still, we shrugged it off. Maybe it was just one of those weird things. We were so happy to see our friend that we quickly forgot about it. The weekend was great, full of all the stuff you'd expect, laughs, late-night talks, bad cafeteria food. By the time we left on Sunday, the weird drive there felt like a distant memory. On the way back, the trip was much quicker, just over 3 hours, exactly like it was supposed to be. I remember my friend and I commenting on it like, that's weird, but we didn't dwell on it. Life moved on, and we both figured it was just some fluke. But then, a few months later, I decided to visit our friend again, this time by myself. I followed the same directions, expecting everything to feel familiar. For the first half of the trip, it did. I recognized the turns, the landmarks, the long stretches of highway. But I kept waiting for the woods. I braced myself for that long, eerie stretch of road I'd driven through the first time. It never came. The drive was normal, pleasant even. No endless trees, no suffocating darkness, no strange sense of time slipping away. I made it to her town in just under 3 hours, exactly as she'd said it would take the first time. The whole thing felt so ordinary. It was like that first trip had happened in a completely different world. I couldn't stop thinking about it. On the drive back, I paid even closer attention. I retraced every mile, scanning for any sign of the woods, but there was nothing. Just highways, fields, and the occasional gas station. It was almost as if that road through the forest had never existed. Over the years, I've been back to visit her a handful of times. Every trip has been the same, 3 hours, no detours, no mysterious woods. I even tried deliberately taking slightly different routes, hoping to stumble back onto that strange path. But no matter what I did, I couldn't replicate it. The wedding had been a few hours away from home, out in the middle of nowhere. You know the kind of place, wide open fields, winding country roads, and no streetlights for miles. My boyfriend had stayed sober, so he could drive us home, while I definitely enjoyed the open bar a little too much. By the time we hit the road, I was happily buzzed, maybe a little too tired and ready to pass out. The first part of the drive was uneventful. I was half dozing in the passenger seat, leaning against the window as the car rocked gently on the uneven roads. The stars were out, and everything outside was pitch black except for the small cone of light cast by our headlights. It felt like we were the only people in the world, and honestly, I wasn't paying much attention. At some point, though, I remember feeling uncomfortable. There was this sudden brightness, like floodlights or something, blasting through the car. I squinted against the glare, thinking maybe it was another vehicle passing, or just my eyes playing tricks on me. But then, out of nowhere, my boyfriend let out a scream. And not just any scream. It was guttural, raw, the kind of sound that makes your blood run cold, because you know it's coming from a place of pure terror. He swerved the car so hard that we nearly went into a ditch. The tires screeched, and my heart leapt into my throat as I jolted upright, fully awake. "What? What's wrong?" I yelled, still trying to figure out what was happening. He was breathing heavily, his hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles turned white. "There was a truck," he managed to choke out. "A massive truck coming straight at us. I thought we were going to die." His voice was shaking, and I could tell he meant it. He looked pale, almost sick. I turned in my seat, craning my neck to look behind us. The road stretched out long and straight into the darkness, completely empty. No headlights, no taillights, no rumble of an engine fading into the distance. Nothing. At first, I thought maybe he'd just imagined it. It was late, after all, and we were both exhausted. "Are you sure?" I asked gently, trying not to spook him more. "Maybe you fell asleep for a second? Or, I don't know, maybe it was your eyes playing tricks on you." He shook his head, adamant. "No. I saw it. I saw the headlights. It was huge. It was coming right at us, like it was going to hit us head on." I wanted to believe him, but it didn't make sense. We were on this narrow country road, just wide enough for 2 cars to pass, and there was no way a truck could have barreled past us without at least clipping our car. If it had gone off the road, we'd have heard it. Our old junker of a car was so loud that even a little vibration made it rattle like crazy. But the road was silent now, almost eerily so. There was no sign of a truck, no trace that it had ever been there. I tried to shake it off. "Maybe it turned off somewhere," I suggested, though I knew how unlikely that was. There were no side roads, no driveways, nothing but open fields and trees as far as the eye could see. He didn't respond. His hands were still trembling, and his eyes darted between the road and the mirrors like he was expecting the truck to reappear. I didn't know what else to say, so I let it drop. The tension in the car was suffocating, and I spent the rest of the drive home staring out the window, every nerve on edge. But here's the thing, I can't completely brush it off either. Because as much as I wanted to believe it was just his imagination, I do remember the lights. Just before he screamed, there was this sudden, blinding light that filled the car. I wasn't fully awake, but I know I saw it. It wasn't like a normal car passing. It was brighter, harsher, like stadium lights pointed straight at us. And then it was gone, just like that. When we finally made it back to the city, we didn't talk much. I think we were both too shaken to bring it up. But over the next few days, I couldn't stop replaying it in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those lights. Every time I thought about my boyfriend's scream, I felt that cold, sinking dread in my stomach all over again. I tried Googling the area, thinking maybe there was a logical explanation. Maybe there'd been reports of accidents or weird road conditions, or maybe someone had pranked us with some kind of high-beam setup. But I couldn't find anything. It was like the road didn't want to give up its secrets. As a retired long-distance truck driver, he'd spent countless hours on the road, often through the dead of night on lonely highways. Most of his tales were funny or fascinating, about odd people he met at truck stops or strange places he'd passed along the way. But there was one story, one he told in a hushed, serious tone, that stayed with me. It wasn't funny, or even just eerie, it was something else entirely. Something that made me believe there's more to this world than what we can explain. It happened when my grandpa was in his 30s, driving one of his usual overnight routes. He was on a twisting country road in the middle of nowhere. It was one of those narrow roads that barely had enough space for 2 cars to pass, let alone a semi. On his right, the woods pressed close to the road, dark and thick, the kind where your headlights barely seemed to penetrate. On the left, open fields sloped down toward a silent, still lake. There were no streetlights, no houses, no signs of life, just the silver glow of the moon and the rumble of his truck. He told me that driving those roads at night always felt strange. There's something about the emptiness that gets under your skin, especially when it feels like you're the only person for miles. But my grandpa wasn't the type to spook easily. He was used to being alone in the cab of his truck, with nothing but the hum of the engine and the crackling static of an old radio for company. That night, though, was different. The road was empty, as far as he could see. He'd been cruising for a while, probably faster than he should have been. When my grandpa said he was going a bit faster, I always knew it meant he was blazing down the road, pushing the truck as fast as it could go. He was zoned in, the road unfolding ahead of him in the glow of his headlights. And then it happened. He felt hands on his shoulders. Not a brush or a tap, actual hands, firm and deliberate, gripping him through the fabric of his shirt. At the same moment, a voice whispered his name, so close he could feel the warmth of breath on his skin. It wasn't just any voice. It was his mother's voice. Here's the part that makes this story so haunting. His mother had been gone for years. She'd passed away when he was in his 20s. Hearing her voice again wasn't just startling, it was impossible. My grandpa froze, his mind reeling. Was he dreaming? Was he losing it? For a moment, he thought he might have nodded off at the wheel and imagined it. But the hands on his shoulders were real, solid and undeniable. Without even thinking, he slammed on the brakes. The truck screeched to a halt, the tires screaming against the pavement. He jolted forward, the seatbelt digging into his chest. The smell of burning rubber filled the cab, and for a second, everything was chaos. Then his headlights lit up what lay ahead. A pileup. 3 cars, crushed and mangled, blocking the entire road. Broken glass glittered on the pavement, and dark stains streaked the ground. The scene looked fresh, like it had just happened moments before. If my grandpa hadn't braked when he did, he would have plowed straight into the wreckage, adding his semi to the carnage. For a moment, he just sat there, stunned. His heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it might burst out of his chest. The cab was silent now, except for the faint crackle of the radio and the low hum of the idling engine. He looked around, half expecting to see something, or someone in the passenger seat. But he was alone. He climbed out of the truck, his legs trembling, and approached the wreckage. The closer he got, the worse it looked. The cars were mangled beyond recognition, their shapes twisted into jagged, broken metal. Inside, he found people, injured, moaning, trapped in the wreckage. Some of them were unconscious, their faces pale and streaked with blood. It was a miracle any of them were still alive. This was back before cell phones, so my grandpa had to drive several miles to find a payphone. He called for help, gave them the location, and then returned to the crash site to stay with the victims until emergency services arrived. He didn't have any medical training, but he did what he could, offering reassurance, keeping people awake, trying to comfort those who were conscious. When the paramedics and firefighters finally arrived, they told my grandpa that his actions might have saved lives. If he'd crashed into the wreckage, it would have made things worse, not just for him, but for the people already trapped in the cars. Later, after everything was cleaned up and he was back on the road, my grandpa couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The hands, the voice, the sudden urge to brake, it didn't make sense. He tried to come up with logical explanations. Maybe he'd been so tired that his mind played tricks on him. Maybe it was just an instinct, some subconscious part of him recognizing danger before he consciously realized it. But my grandpa didn't believe that. He swore, even years later, that it wasn't just his imagination. He believed it was his mother, warning him, saving him, and the people in those cars, from what could have been a much worse disaster. Every time he told this story, I could see the emotion in his eyes. He'd always get quiet at the end, staring off into the distance like he was back on that road. It wasn't just a story to him. It was something real, something that had shaped him in ways he couldn't fully explain. There's nothing quite like a road trip to bring out the best and worst in a person. It's long hours of open road, greasy gas station snacks, and the kind of silence that makes you overthink every decision. I've been on my fair share of them, but there's one trip I'll never forget. It wasn't because of the destination, or even the journey itself. It was because of what happened in the middle of South Dakota, on a stretch of road that felt like it might never end. It started like any other road trip. My mom and I were driving from California to Ohio, our little sedan packed to the brim with luggage, snacks, and way too much caffeine. The plan was to make it in 4 days, taking turns behind the wheel while the other rested. By the time we hit South Dakota, we were tired but making good time. The landscape had flattened out into endless prairies, and the road stretched straight ahead, the kind of highway that hypnotizes you if you stare too long. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I noticed something unsettling. The check engine light flicked on. My stomach sank. I wasn't a car expert by any means, but I knew enough to realize that wasn't a good sign. I pointed it out to my mom, who gave me a tight-lipped, "We'll keep an eye on it." That was her way of saying, "Let's not panic yet," though her grip on the armrest suggested otherwise. We kept driving, the twilight fading into full darkness. The only lights came from our headlights and the occasional car passing in the opposite direction. Then, out of nowhere, the smooth asphalt highway we'd been cruising on just stopped. I don't mean it turned into a bumpy road. I mean it ended. 1 second we were on a proper highway, and the next we were on a dirt path that looked like something out of a ghost town. There weren't even lines to mark where we were supposed to go, just hard-packed dirt stretching into the darkness, with the occasional orange construction sign leaning crookedly to one side. We slowed to a crawl, staring out at this eerie new terrain. The headlights illuminated clouds of dust kicking up around us, making it even harder to see. "Is this right?" I asked my mom, though I already knew the answer. We didn't have a choice. There was nowhere to turn around, no detour signs, and definitely no buildings or gas stations in sight. It was just us, the car, and this unsettling dirt road. The first few minutes weren't too bad, just bumpy and slow. But as the minutes stretched into miles, the tension in the car grew thicker. The road was uneven, our tires crunching over rocks and grooves carved into the dirt. Every bump made me wince, my eyes darting to that glowing check engine light like it was counting down to disaster. The darkness beyond our headlights was absolute. No stars, no moon, just pitch-black nothingness. I kept imagining what might be out there, just beyond the edges of the light. Animals, broken-down cars, or worse, people waiting for some unlucky driver like us. My mom stayed quiet, her hands gripping the dashboard like it might steady the car. Her silence only made it worse, the quiet broken only by the low hum of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. We hadn't seen another car for what felt like hours. I checked my phone, hoping for a little reassurance, but of course, there was no signal. Not even a single bar. "Great," I muttered, shoving it back into the cup holder. My mom glanced at me, but said nothing. She didn't have to. We were both thinking the same thing. We were completely on our own. The road stretched on, mile after mile of uncertainty. Every so often, we'd see a faded construction sign warning of uneven ground or sharp turns. But there were no workers, no equipment, just those lonely, crooked signs. At one point, we passed a barricade on the side of the road, half buried in the dirt like it had been forgotten there. It was eerie, like we'd stumbled into a place we weren't supposed to be. I tried to make small talk to break the tension, but it was useless. My mom wasn't in the mood, and honestly, neither was I. Every minute felt like an hour, and every bump in the road made my heart jump. The check engine light glared at me like a reminder of how quickly this could all go wrong. What if the car broke down? What if we got stuck out here, miles from civilization? The thought of being stranded in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but darkness, was enough to make my chest tighten. We drove like that for what must have been 30 miles, though it felt like 300. Finally, just when I was starting to think the dirt road would never end, the headlights caught a glint of something ahead, pavement. I almost didn't believe it at first, but as we got closer, the smooth blacktop of a real highway came into view. It felt like finding an oasis in the desert. We pulled onto the asphalt, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. My mom relaxed too, her grip on the dashboard easing as she leaned back in her seat. The check engine light was still on, but for now the car seemed fine. We were back on a proper road, with lines and signs and the faint, reassuring sense of being on the right path again. Pulling into the Bakken oil field in North Dakota, a trip that felt less like a drive and more like something ripped from a fever dream. Even now, it feels more like a story I'd tell around a campfire than something I actually lived through. It was around 1 a.m., and I was behind the wheel of a large RV, towing a truck. My GPS had betrayed me earlier, guiding me onto what it generously called a road. In reality, it was a barely navigable stretch of dirt riddled with potholes big enough to swallow tires and rocks that looked like they'd been casually tossed there by a bored giant. The GPS insisted this was just road construction, but I wasn't so sure. After what felt like hours of white-knuckling it through that nightmare, I finally made it to a two-lane highway. At first, the highway seemed like a reprieve. The asphalt felt like silk compared to the chaos I'd just escaped, and I let out a sigh of relief. That relief lasted all of 10 seconds before the first truck roared past me. I barely had time to register it. A massive, hulking semi barreling down the road at 80 miles per hour, decked out like something out of Mad Max. The sheer force of it shook my RV, sending the whole rig swaying in the wind. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to keep the RV steady as another one tore past me, its headlights glaring like twin suns. It wasn't just the trucks. The wind had picked up, howling across the flatlands like it had a personal vendetta against me. It whipped my RV around like a toy, making every passing truck feel like a near-death experience. I could barely see past the glow of my headlights, the dark stretching endlessly in every direction. The highway felt abandoned except for me and these monstrous rigs, like we were the only ones left in some apocalyptic wasteland. And then I crested a hill. The moment I reached the top, the world opened up before me, and what I saw made my stomach twist. The sky was an unnatural orange-red, glowing faintly behind a layer of low-hanging clouds. It wasn't the soft, warm glow of a sunset or even the eerie light of a city skyline. This was something else entirely, something sinister. The hills in the distance were dotted with flames, huge columns of fire shooting straight into the night like the earth itself was burning. They weren't wildfires, they were flares, burning off excess natural gas from the oil fields. I knew that, intellectually, but knowing didn't make it any less unsettling. For a moment, I just stared, my brain struggling to process what I was seeing. It felt like I'd stumbled into another world, some hellish landscape where the air itself was alive with fire and the sky bled orange. The road snaked down into a valley, the hills on either side flickering with flames. The trucks, with their hulking shapes and roaring engines, didn't help. They looked like demons racing through the inferno, their headlights cutting through the haze like knives. I kept driving, but my hands were shaking. The RV felt impossibly small and fragile, like a tin can being tossed around in a hurricane. Every gust of wind, every passing truck, every flicker of those flames made my heart race. It wasn't just the physical danger, though that was very real. It was the overwhelming sense of being somewhere I wasn't supposed to be, somewhere the rules of the world didn't quite apply. The hours dragged on. The road twisted and turned through the valley, the flares burning like sentinels on the hills. I kept glancing at my rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, or someone following me. The night felt alive, the shadows shifting and dancing in the orange glow. Even the trucks, as terrifying as they were, started to feel like part of the landscape, as if they belonged here more than I ever could. At one point, I pulled over to catch my breath. The RV rocked in the wind as I stepped outside, my boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The air was thick, heavy with the smell of oil, and something metallic I couldn't quite place. I looked up at the sky, hoping for some stars to ground me, but the clouds had swallowed them whole. All I could see was the faint, flickering glow of the flares reflected in the clouds, painting everything in shades of orange and red. Standing there, I felt impossibly small. The flames on the hills roared silently, their light dancing on the edges of my vision. The wind howled through the valley, carrying with it the distant rumble of another truck. I climbed back into the RV, locking the door behind me like that would somehow keep the night out. The rest of the drive was a blur. The flames never seemed to end, and neither did the trucks. By the time I finally pulled into a small town on the edge of the oil fields, it was almost dawn. The sky was starting to lighten, the orange glow fading into the pale blue of morning. I parked the RV in a lot behind a diner, turned off the engine, and just sat there for a while, staring at the horizon. The town was quiet, the world still, but the memory of that valley stayed with me. There's something magical about driving through Vermont in the winter. The snow blankets everything, muffling sound and turning the world into this quiet, frozen wonderland. That was the vibe as I drove home late one night in February 2012, after giving a presentation up north. It was around 10 or 10:30 p.m., and the sky was so clear you could practically see forever. The stars were impossibly bright, scattered across the blackness like someone had shaken a box of glitter over the world. It felt like I was the only person on the planet, just me and the open road. It was cold, ridiculously cold, and my car heater was doing its best to fight back the chill creeping through the windows. The tires crunched rhythmically over the snow-packed road as I wound through the countryside. The stillness was comforting, almost hypnotic, and I'd settled into that familiar road trip rhythm, half listening to some late-night radio show as the miles ticked by. And then it happened. Out of nowhere, the world turned blue. It wasn't like anything I'd ever seen before. 1 second, the snow-covered fields around me were bathed in the soft, pale light of the moon. The next, it was like someone had flipped a switch and turned on the brightest blue light imaginable. The flash was massive, lighting up everything from horizon to horizon. The trees, the road, the mountains in the distance, it all glowed, this vivid, electric blue that made it feel like the entire world had changed color for a moment. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding slightly on the icy road, as I instinctively glanced up. But by the time I looked, the light was gone. Everything was dark again, the stars twinkling innocently as if nothing had happened. The silence pressed in around me, thick and heavy, like the world was holding its breath. For a second, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, trying to process what I'd just seen. My heart was pounding, and my brain was throwing out wild explanations. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of electrical issue? Did I just see aliens? Yeah, I know, but when you're alone on a deserted road in Vermont and the sky lights up blue, your mind goes to weird places. Eventually, I started driving again, though I was still half expecting the sky to light up a second time. As I rounded a bend, the landscape came into view, perfectly normal but somehow surreal. The snow, the trees, the mountains, they all looked the same, but now they felt different, like they were holding some kind of secret I wasn't privy to. It wasn't until I got home that I found out what had happened. The internet was buzzing with reports of a meteor, a massive one, that had entered the atmosphere and exploded high overhead. The explosion had created a blue flash so bright it was visible from Norfolk, Virginia, all the way to Ottawa, Canada. But apparently, Vermont had been in the sweet spot. For a few breathtaking seconds, our little corner of the world had been lit up like something out of a sci-fi movie. I dove into the details. The meteor had been massive, big enough to generate a sonic boom as it disintegrated in the atmosphere, though I hadn't heard it. Maybe the car's insulation or the thick snow absorbed the sound. People from across the region were sharing stories online, describing how their backyards, highways, and snow-covered fields had been bathed in that same otherworldly blue light. The more I read, the more I started to appreciate just how rare and incredible the experience had been. Meteors aren't exactly uncommon, but one this bright, seen across such a wide area, was the kind of thing that only happens once in a lifetime. And to be driving through northern Vermont, under that perfectly clear sky, right in the middle of it all, it felt like winning the cosmic lottery. Even now, when I think back to that night, I can still see that flash in my mind's eye. It wasn't just the light itself that made it unforgettable. It was the way it seemed to transform everything around me. For those few seconds, the quiet Vermont countryside turned into something alien, like I'd been transported to another world. And when the light disappeared, it left behind this strange, electric feeling, as if the universe had just let me in on a secret I wasn't quite meant to know. Driving through Vermont in winter is magical enough on its own. But that night, it felt like the universe itself had decided to put on a show just for me. And let me tell you, it was a show I'll never forget. It was pitch dark, the kind of dark where even your headlights seem useless, and the rain was coming down in sheets. I'd been on this road before, so I wasn't too worried at first. But what happened next? It still makes me shudder when I think about it. The road I was on was a bit tricky. At one point, it splits. One lane in each direction turns into two, with one set of lanes going high and the other dipping low. Between them, there's this thick strip of trees, almost like a natural divider. Normally, the whole setup is easy to navigate, but that night, with the rain obscuring everything and the lines on the road practically invisible, it became a nightmare. I was crawling along, squinting through the rain, trying to keep my tires on what little of the road I could make out. My wipers were going full blast, but it felt like they were doing nothing. I came around a bend, and suddenly, headlights appeared ahead of me. At first, they looked far off, faint through the rain, so I didn't think much of it. But then they got brighter, and closer, and I realized they were coming straight at me. My stomach dropped. What the? I swerved hard, barely managing to get my car off the road and into the muddy shoulder. Horns blared as a line of cars sped past me, their headlights cutting through the rain like accusing eyes. I was shaking, gripping the wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. What just happened? I sat there for a second, trying to make sense of it. Then it hit me. I must have gone up the wrong split. The trees in the middle must have obscured the oncoming cars until it was too late. My heart was racing, but I couldn't just stay parked in the mud. I flicked on my hazard lights and inched forward, sticking as close to the edge of the road as I could. My plan was to find a break in the divide. There were usually crossovers every few hundred yards, and get back onto the correct side. But the road felt endless. Every second felt like an eternity as I crawled along the shoulder, rain hammering against my windshield. The mud was slick, my tires sliding every so often, and I kept glancing back in case another set of headlights decided to come barreling toward me. Finally, after what felt like miles, I spotted a gap in the tree line. A crossover. Relief washed over me as I turned my wheel, angling my car toward the brake. And then bam! I nearly slammed into a gate. What the heck is a gate doing here? I muttered, my voice shaking. The rain made it impossible to see beyond my headlights, but the gate was unmistakable, solid metal, and completely blocking the crossover. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Why would there be a gate in the middle of a road? Had I somehow veered even farther off course? Frustrated, I turned back onto the shoulder and crept forward, hoping to find another break. But something wasn't sitting right. The road looked different, cleaner, clearer. The trees on my right seemed farther away than they should have been, and there were no headlights coming toward me anymore. Slowly, it started to click. I wasn't on the wrong side of the road. They were. All those cars, the ones that nearly ran me off the road, they'd been going the wrong way. I had been on the correct side the whole time. I pulled over, sitting there in disbelief as the realization sank in. The rain kept pounding against the roof, and for a moment, I just sat in stunned silence. I replayed the scene in my head. The blinding rain, the distant headlights, the rush of cars swerving past me. It all made sense now. Somehow, they'd gotten onto the wrong split of the road, not me. Feeling a mix of relief and lingering adrenaline, I got back onto the road, my side of the road, and started driving again. The rain hadn't let up, but I didn't care anymore. The cars that had been on the wrong side were long gone, and for the first time all night, the road felt empty and safe. Road trips are supposed to be fun, right? Music blasting, junk food piled high, and a sense of freedom you only really get when the highway stretches out in front of you. That's exactly what I thought when my best friend Logan and I decided to drive from Washington to California, and then all the way to Mexico. We were 20 years old, feeling invincible, and ready for an adventure. But the trip turned out to be way more unsettling than I ever expected. One night in particular still gives me chills. It was late, probably past midnight, and Logan was behind the wheel. I was riding shotgun, completely knocked out after hours of driving and way too much fast food. I was jolted awake by the sound of Logan talking. At first, I thought he was talking to me, but when I glanced over, his eyes were locked on the road, and he was muttering under his breath. "Logan, what are you doing?" I asked, groggily rubbing my eyes. He jumped, gripping the wheel like I'd caught him doing something he wasn't supposed to. "Nothing," he said quickly. Too quickly. His voice was tight, almost panicked. I stared at him for a second, my brain still half asleep, and decided to brush it off. "Okay, do you want me to take over driving?" I offered. "No, I'm good," he said, his voice sharper than usual. I shrugged and leaned back in my seat. He seemed off, but I figured it was just the exhaustion kicking in. Road trips are tiring, and Logan wasn't exactly great at admitting when he needed help. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the car lull me back to sleep. The next time I woke up, it was because I needed to change the playlist on my iPod. The car was still moving, and the only sound was the steady rumble of the tires on the road. I glanced over at Logan. He wasn't muttering anymore, which was a relief, but his grip on the wheel was so tight his knuckles were white. His face was set, eyes glued to the road like he was trying to block something out. "You good?" I asked, trying to sound casual. He just nodded, not taking his eyes off the road. I didn't push it. I figured he was just tired and cranky. I picked a new playlist, leaned back, and fell asleep again. When I woke up the third time, something was very, very wrong. The car wasn't moving. I sat up, blinking in confusion, and realized we weren't on the road anymore. We were in the middle of a field, about 50 feet off the highway. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating tall grass and nothing else. Logan was gone. Panic hit me like a freight train. I threw open the door and scrambled out, my heart racing. I could see the faint outline of the road in the distance. How the hell did we end up here? And where the hell was Logan? Logan! I yelled, my voice breaking the eerie silence. I circled the car, the cold air biting at my skin. That's when I saw him. He was sitting on the ground in front of the car, hunched over with his arms wrapped around his knees, muttering to himself again. The headlights cast long shadows, making the whole scene look even more surreal. My fear turned into anger as I stormed toward him. "What the hell, Logan?" I demanded. "What's going on? Why are we out here?" He didn't look up. He just kept muttering, his voice so low I couldn't make out the words. It was like he was in some kind of trance. I knelt down in front of him, shaking his shoulders. "Logan, talk to me." Finally, he looked at me, his eyes wide and glassy. "I don't know," he whispered. "I don't know what happened." That was all he would say. He just kept repeating it like a broken record. "I don't know. I don't know." I felt a chill run down my spine. I'd never seen him like this before. Logan, who was always the funny, confident one, now looked completely lost. I decided we needed to get the hell out of there. I half-dragged, half-carried him back to the car and threw his jacket over him. Then I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and got us back to the road as quickly as I could. The whole time, Logan just stared out the window, silent except for the occasional muttered, "I don't know." We found a motel a few miles down the road, and I didn't waste any time checking us in. I practically had to shove Logan into the room. He crawled into bed without saying a word, while I sat awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to piece together what had just happened. The next morning, everything was normal. Logan woke up acting like nothing had happened. He was laughing, joking, and shoveling pancakes into his mouth like the night before hadn't completely derailed my sanity. When I finally brought it up, he waved it off. "You were dreaming or something," he said, grinning. "It was nothing. Forget about it. Logan, you drove us into a field and disappeared," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "You were muttering to yourself and wouldn't tell me what was going on." "That's not nothing." But he wouldn't budge. He just kept brushing me off, making jokes, and acting like I was the one who was losing it. Part of me wanted to press him harder, but the other part was too freaked out to deal with it. Maybe he didn't remember, or maybe he didn't want to. To this day, I still don't know what happened that night. I've replayed it in my head 100 times, trying to make sense of it, but I always come up empty. What was he muttering about? Why did he drive off the road? And what was he doing out in that field? 3 years ago, my two friends and I took a road trip from Texas to California. It was supposed to be this fun, carefree adventure, with lots of random stops and no real plan other than to make it to the West Coast in one piece. For the most part, that's exactly how it went. We'd stop for gas, grab food from questionable roadside diners, and crash at cheap motels whenever we were too tired to keep driving. A couple of times, in an effort to save money, we even slept in the car at rest stops. Spoiler alert, that's not a great idea. This particular night, we were somewhere in Arizona. It was late, probably close to midnight, and we were all dead tired. We'd been driving all day, and the thought of finding a motel felt like too much effort. The rest stop we pulled into was completely empty. No cars, no people, just us and the eerie quiet of the desert night. The silence was unsettling, but we were too exhausted to care. I was sitting in the driver's seat, while my friends were sprawled out in the back of the truck in sleeping bags. They passed out almost immediately, but I couldn't fall asleep. Something about the rest stop felt off. I chalked it up to paranoia. It's not like sleeping in the middle of nowhere is supposed to feel cozy. I got out of the truck a few times to stretch my legs and hit up the vending machine by the bathrooms. The night was pitch black, with only a few dim overhead lights flickering in the lot. Each time I stepped out, I found myself glancing around, half expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But the parking lot was empty, and the stillness was almost suffocating. Finally, around 4 a.m., I dozed off. It didn't last long. The Mountain Dew I'd chugged earlier caught up with me, and I woke up needing to pee. I was about to open the door to get out when I froze. Across the empty parking lot, near the edge of the lights, I saw someone standing there. At first, I thought my tired brain was playing tricks on me. I squinted, trying to make out the figure. It looked like a man, standing perfectly still with his back to the highway, and his face turned toward me. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring. My stomach dropped. This was the kind of thing you see in horror movies. The kind of thing that makes you scream at the characters on the screen to drive away. Except this time, I was the character, and this was real. I turned and whisper yelled to my friends in the back. "Hey, wake up." One of them groaned in response, and the other didn't even budge. Frustrated, I opened the small back window of the truck and tried again. "Guys, wake up." Now. Finally they stirred, but before they could even sit up, I turned back toward the figure. My heart nearly stopped. He was closer, much closer. He had moved from the edge of the lot to the middle, and now I could see him clearly. He was wearing all black, black jacket, black pants, and black gloves. His face was shadowed, but I could feel his gaze locked on me. My chest tightened as I realized he was pointing. His gloved hand was stretched out, pointing toward the field behind the truck. The motion wasn't aggressive, but it was deliberate, like he wanted me to look away from him and toward whatever was in the field. My whole body screamed not to do it, but I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder toward the dark expanse of the field, but there was nothing there. Just grass and shadows. "Guys, wake up! Look!" I yelled, my voice breaking this time. Both of my friends finally sat up, their faces groggy but alarmed by the panic in my voice. "What's wrong?" one of them asked, looking around. I turned back toward the man, ready to point him out, but he was gone. The parking lot was empty again. I scanned the area, my heart racing, but he was nowhere to be seen. I looked toward the bathrooms, toward the field, even back down the highway. Nothing. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. "What is it? What did you see?" my other friend asked, her voice tense. I didn't know how to explain it. All I could say was, there was a guy. He was right there. He was pointing at the field. My friends exchanged worried glances, and I could see the fear starting to creep into their faces. They didn't question me further, though. Whatever I'd seen, they trusted me enough to know it wasn't worth sticking around to figure out. Within seconds, they were scrambling to grab their sleeping bags, and we all piled into the truck. I didn't even bother buckling my seatbelt before I started the engine. My hands were shaking as I reversed out of the lot and pulled back onto the highway. The whole time, I kept glancing in the mirrors, half expecting to see the man standing in the middle of the road. But he never appeared. We drove in silence for miles before anyone said anything. "You're sure there was someone there?" one of my friends finally asked. I just nodded. "Yeah, I'm sure." To this day, I have no idea who or what I saw that night.